You remember back the last couple sessions where we tracked the cartooning decline and fall of Thomas Nast from being a great expositor of African American equality to somebody who just got absolutely soured black political activity, and clearly by the end of his cartoon sequence that we showed before is very, very much on the side of white supremacy. Well, today we are moving further into that problem and going back in time a long, long ways. The boundaries of what we're talking about today go all the way from 1660 to 1990. And what we're going to try to get our arms around, if we possibly can, is the size and extent of this law of gravity, this white noise that I've been trying to get us to see as a historical reality that spills into our time, determines our behavior. And unless we face up to it courageously and begin to understand that we don't own this history except to the extent that we own its consequences. That's the whole point here, so that we can learn how not to be like Thomas Nast and use a different example, maybe Frederick Douglass, and continue to show up. Well, today's dive into the past is very, very long and very large. And we have on the screen here a gigantic list of every single researchable and verifiable incidents involving violence and African American people from the 1660s all the way until the 1960s. Look at the size of that list. Just sit back for a minute, cast your eyes down column 1, realize that it goes beyond what the bottom of the screen says is the end. Scroll back up, go down number 2, then go down number 3. What you're seeing is a list of slave insurrections, incursions and violence and murder by white mobs into African American communities, lynchings, police shootings, urban rebellions in response to police shootings. Remember, I'm recording this in the same day that Kenosha, Wisconsin is recognizing the fact that a young African American man, according to the body cams, was shot in the back as he was trying to get into his car by a Kenosha policeman. That will be on this list, along with many, many other names that we have to try and remember when we hear the demand from African American activists to say their names. If this kind of teaching were to involve instead photos of atrocities, bodies in the streets, people hanging from trees, all that you'd be seeing on the screen is a re-victimization, again, for you, of what happened long ago. That kind of image also has the terrible impact of asking you to recoil in horror rather than thinking more deeply, why did this happen? It's sensationalism. It's consumerism. The list seems very, very neutral and very unthreatening until you really look into it. Because when you do, you're exercising your imagination to get underneath the list, to think about the lived experience that that list is trying to convey. This is very hard stuff to try and make moral sense out of. How do you make historical perspective on something like this? The answer is that that was then and this is now. In a fundamental way, we didn't do any of this stuff, we white folks that are sitting right here going back and forth with me. That's what our predecessors did. But at the same time, remember, those are the events and those are the accumulated traumas and memories that are in the minds, known in the bones by African American people. Those are their family stories. Our job is to extend ourselves behind all that and at the same time remember certain important things. While that was then and this is now, that list can be accompanied by another list, if you want to, of people who are resisting the law of gravity. There's a lot of resistance to the law of gravity in this list, actually, that has to do with slave insurrections, that has to do with fugitive slave insurrections and violence in northern cities, that has to do with the civil rights movement, involving black and white people together. There's a counter list, or there's a complication list that sits in the middle of all of this. For all of the fact that this is now and that was then, you know that there's a deep moral argument being made. People are answering back. People are showing up inside this list. They're showing up either by default, by saying, that's life, that's the rules, that's what happens, and that's the majority of white opinion that creates the law of gravity. There's also a counter and dissenting opinion, and this is true all the time, then and now. Nothing but freedom, nothing but freedom. We've abolished the slave, the master remains. We don't have technical slavery anymore, but we do have remaining masters. And sometimes we have simply people who allow mastery to happen in that other community from which we're so heavily segregated, which is why I've suggested before at various occasions personal disruption in your own life, to shop someplace else, worship someplace else, invest someplace else, find real friendship if you can. It's not as hard as you think it is. It sounds disruptive. It can be stressful. But in the long run, when the next urban tragedy and drama involving the police happens, or when the debate about defunding the police or whatever it is on your mind, you don't have to, I don't believe, if you dig deeply enough behind the list here, ask the question, what should I be doing? Because you're already doing things. The point of these little tonic doses is to get people like me and like you to consider changing the direction as we walk out the door. That's America, with violence being as American as apple pie or cherry pie or whichever it is. It's an intimidating thing to think about. It's important to see it in its mass. If you can get to this website and start clicking on the individual incidents, you'll be able to really become involved in the details of these things. You won't have to do very much of it in order to understand that it's very important for us to toughen ourselves up, to be courageous, to look at that whole list and say, yep, that's what happened. That's what's accumulated, and that's what we have to work against. That's what we have to unwind. History is basically like lifting free weights. You develop your muscles, you get rid of your fragility, and you do your best. Thanks so much.